My father's face was a masterpiece of disbelief. The proud, self-satisfied smirk he always wore when holding court. It just froze. The warmth drained from his eyes, replaced by a glassy shock as the entire officers' club fell into a sudden deep silence. All eyes went from him to the large television mounted on the wall, where my official government photograph stared out. From the crowd, a choked whisper from one of his oldest friends, another colonel, cut through the quiet. "Robert, my God, that's her. That's Valkyrie." 2 hours earlier, that same room had been filled with the booming sound of my father's laughter. This was the world of retired Colonel Robert Jensen, my father, a man whose entire identity was forged in command and who saw life only through the lens of a warrior's legacy. He was in his element, surrounded by his old unit, the air thick with stories of past glories. When an old comrade asked about his children, he immediately launched into a glowing report on my brother, Mark, the family. His golden boy, whose mid-level marketing job was always spun into a saga of boardroom conquests and strategic victories. Then came the inevitable, tired question he always seemed to dread. "And what about your daughter, Eris?" My father let out a dismissive chuckle, a sharp barking sound that was all condescension. "Eris? Oh, she's an embarrassment," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the table for everyone to hear. "Push his papers for some DC think tank. All brains, no grit." He paused for effect, expecting a round of knowing laughter from the men who understood what real strength was. He never got it. Instead, there were a few tight, uncomfortable smiles and the shuffling of feet. The insult landed with the same familiar sting it always did, another tally. Mark on a long list of dismissed achievements and overlooked successes, the science fairs he'd called a waste of time, the scholarships he'd brushed off as book smarts. It was all there in that single, cruel sentence. He saw a daughter who was a disappointment, a footnote in the grand family legacy he was so desperate to build through his son. He had no idea what a joke his words really were. He preached about grit, but he couldn't fathom the courage it took to make the calls. I made every day, where a single analytical error could cost hundreds of lives. He dismissed my work as pushing paper, completely oblivious that the very papers I wrote redirected global assets and shaped national security policy. He was belittling my entire existence in a room full of men whose world was built on the very intelligence operations I secretly commanded. He thought it was another joke at the expense of his bookworm daughter. He had no idea he'd just dismissed the single most successful covert strategic action of the decade, or that the entire world was about to find out who was really behind it. To understand the reckoning that followed, you have to understand the two lives I was forced to live. To understand the two lives I was living, you have to go back to the last Thanksgiving dinner. The air in my parents' house was thick with the scent of roasted turkey and the sound of my father's booming voice. He was Colonel Rhett Robert Jensen, a man obsessed with his military legacy, profoundly disappointed that his daughter chose intellect over infantry. He saw the world in a rigid hierarchy of command. In his eyes, I had chosen to be a civilian, a nobody. His command now extended only to our family, a unit he managed with misplaced military rigor. At his right hand, as always, was my brother, Mark Jensen. Mark was the family's golden boy, a perfectly average marketing manager whose minor promotion was being celebrated as if he'd just received a battlefield commission. My father stood, raising his glass of wine, his face beaming with a pride I had never once seen directed at me. "To Mark," he announced to the captive audience of relatives. A real leader of men, carving out his own empire in the corporate world. The family applauded, a chorus of validation for a perfectly ordinary achievement. I watched the scene, a familiar coldness settling in my stomach. It was the heavy, tired weight of a truth being confirmed, again and again. Later, during a lull in the conversation, I made a quiet attempt to connect. "I had some good news at work, actually," I began, my voice small in the aftermath of Mark's celebration. A geopolitical paper I published was, well, it was cited in a White House daily briefing last week. My father, who had been laughing at something Mark said, turned to me. He gave me a slow, patronizing smile and patted my hand, a gesture meant to dismiss, not to comfort. "That's nice, honey," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "All that reading must be tiring." He called me his bookworm. That was the name he gave my life's work, my passion, my entire identity. A quaint little hobby for his strange, quiet daughter. The sting of it wasn't just in the nickname, It was in the echo of every science fair he'd called a distraction, every academic award he'd brushed aside. He was looking right at me, but he saw absolutely nothing of who I really was. He saw a girl in a library, not a woman whose analysis shaped global events. It was a complete and total erasure. Now, contrast that loud, hollow dining room with my actual world. A sterile, silent, windowless room known as a SCIF, a sensitive, compartmented information facility, at a DARPA annex. The only sound was the hum of classified servers and the low murmur of my own voice. Before me sat a panel of stone-faced military leaders, men who carried the weight of the world on their shoulders. At the head of the table was General Thompson, a 4-star commander who valued my analysis above almost anyone else's. He was a man of few words, with eyes that missed nothing and a mind that processed reality without sentiment or bias. My voice was calm and steady as I walked them through my findings, pointing to a complex digital map of the Persian Gulf. The adversary's feint was designed to draw our naval assets into the strait, leaving their northern flank vulnerable, I explained, the words flowing with practiced authority. My Chimera protocol uses a layered drone and satellite matrix to create a ghost fleet, pinning their resources. While we achieve our primary objective without firing a single shot, I finished my presentation and a profound silence filled the room. The weight of the decision hung in the air. General Thompson leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked on the screen. He looked at the data, then at me, and gave a single, decisive nod. His expression was grimly satisfied. "Execute Chimera," he said, his voice a low gravel. Then he added the 4 words that defined my entire professional existence. "Your call, Doctor." In that moment, I held more power and responsibility than my father could possibly comprehend. There was no condescension here, no pats on the hand. There was only absolute earned respect. The burden was immense, but it was real. This was the duality I lived in. The whiplash between 2 identities was staggering. At home, I was the irrelevant bookworm, a perpetual disappointment. But in those silent, windowless rooms, I was one of a handful of people whose call sign, Valkyrie, was whispered with a kind of awe. The architect of strategies that saved lives and prevented wars. My own mother, a woman who believed family peace was more important than fairness, would try to bridge the gap with well-meaning excuses. "You know how your father is, Eris," she'd say softly after another one of his dismissals. "He just understands things like promotions and ranks. Your work is so complex. Just let him have his pride and mark." Her words were meant to be a balm, but they were salt in the wound. She was confirming that my reality was simply too complicated for them to bother understanding. My life was an inconvenient, messy variable in the simple equation of their family narrative. Mark was the son who followed a recognizable path, so he got the praise. I was the daughter who spoke a language they couldn't comprehend, so I got a pat on the hand. It was a quiet, suffocating injustice that I had learned to bear in silence. For years, I had accepted their world and their rules, hoping one day they'd see my value. But after that phone call, I realized they would never willingly enter my world. So I decided I would bring my world, and its unforgiving rules of evidence and authority, to them. After that disastrous Thanksgiving, something inside me shifted. The long, exhausting campaign to earn my father's emotional approval was finally over. A cold, quiet clarity settled in its place. I realized I had been speaking the wrong language my entire life. The language of emotion, of connection, of a daughter asking her father to simply see her. He didn't speak that language. My father only understood the rigid, unforgiving dialect of the system he worshipped: honor, rank, and public recognition. So I decided I would finally brief him in his native tongue. This wasn't about revenge. It was about providing an official, undeniable correction of the record. The opportunity arrived weeks later, disguised as the highest professional honor of my career. My project, Operation Chimera, had been a stunning success, preventing a shooting war in the Persian Gulf through pure strategy. General Thompson informed me I was being awarded the decoration for exceptional civilian service. Normally, this is a quiet, internal affair for the official record books. But the success of Chimera was too big to bury, and a major defense news network had gotten wind of the story and was aggressively pursuing an exclusive. I knew exactly who I needed to call. My ally was Major Evans, a sharp public affairs officer whose quiet loyalty was sealed a year ago. when one of my threat analyses had saved his brother's infantry unit from a devastating ambush. He owed me, and we both knew it. I explained the situation to him on a secure line, not as a wounded daughter seeking retribution, but as a fellow strategist outlining an information operation. I would agree to a heavily sanitized, anonymous interview. He would help me coordinate storytelling and timing with the network. The plan was precise. Like every operation I designed, we worked with the network to ensure the segment would air on a Friday night at exactly 1900 hours Eastern Standard Time. This wasn't a random slot. It was the exact time my father met his old unit for drinks at the Fort Myer Officers Club, where that specific news channel was always on, a permanent fixture in the background of their war stories. I didn't have to send an invitation or make a scene. I just had to set the conditions on the battlefield and let the target walk right into the kill zone. The stage was set. The audience was in place. My father and his friends were about to receive the one thing they respected above all else, an official after-action report. They just didn't know they and their outdated worldview were the targets. Of course, I wasn't there to see it. But I've replayed the scene in my mind 1,000 times, constructed from the details Major Evans gave me later. The Fort Myer Officers Club, exactly as I'd pictured it. The atmosphere was loud and self-congratulatory, thick with the ghosts of old campaigns and the smell of whiskey. My father was in his element, mid-story, his voice booming over the others, a king in his small, familiar court. In the corner, the television was a low, ignored drone, a silent observer, counting down the final seconds of my father's world as he knew it. Then, the anchor's voice cut through the noise, sharp and authoritative. We interrupt this program with a special report. Casual conversations began to taper off. This was their channel, the one that spoke their language. The report began, "We have exclusive details tonight on the clandestine operation that prevented a catastrophic conflict in the Strait of Hormuz." My father and his friends turned up the volume, their professional interest piqued. They listened, rapt, as the anchor described a brilliant, bloodless strategy that had outmaneuvered an enemy force with surgical precision. It was a story of intellect, of foresight, a perfect operation. One of his friends let out a low whistle of appreciation. "Damn fine piece of work," he murmured, shaking his head in awe. "Someone deserves a medal for that." My father's chest swelled with a vicarious pride, the pride of a man who believed he was part of the institution that created such excellence. He nodded sagely, taking a sip of his drink. He felt entitled to this victory, a part of it by association. He was the colonel, the expert in this room. "Now that," he declared, his voice full of gravitas, "is real service." That was his final verdict, his last arrogant judgment before the ground gave way beneath him. The anchor's voice took on a new, more serious tone. "While the identity of the operation's architect has been a closely guarded secret, tonight the Pentagon has authorized us to reveal her name." He likely expected to see the face of a general he knew, a contemporary, someone he could claim a connection to. The anticipation in the room was palpable, in recognition of her receiving the decoration for exceptional civilian service. And then it happened. The screen cut from a satellite map of the Gulf to my official government photograph, not a family snapshot, but a professional headshot. My expression was calm, composed, and serious. It was the face of Dr. Aris Thorne, a complete stranger to the man who called himself my father. The room, which had been buzzing with conversation moments before, went utterly and profoundly silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the worn carpet. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the hum of the television. Then, a gasp from someone near my father. "No way. That's her. Jensen, she's the one on the news." The statement hung in the air, a grenade with the pin pulled. Then from the bar, another voice, an active-duty intelligence officer who knew the whispers, the legends. His eyes were wide with a dawning, electrifying recognition. "Project Chimera? We've been hearing rumors for months." He turned to stare at my father, his voice a mixture of shock and awe. "They call the analyst who designed it Valkyrie." "That's her?" My father's change was instant and brutal. All the color drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy mask of disbelief. His chest, which had been puffed out with pride, seemed to deflate as if all the air had been stolen from his lungs. The smug certainty in his eyes was replaced by a hollow, sickening shock. He couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. He was a statue, frozen in the moment of his own undoing, the light from the TV flashing on his stunned face. The men around him were no longer looking at him with camaraderie, but with a new, unnerving expression. It was a mixture of stunned confusion and a dawning, horrified respect, not for him but for me. He had just called the architect of a legendary strategic operation, a hero by his own rigid standards, an embarrassment. He had dismissed her as having no grit. He was publicly, utterly, and professionally humiliated by the very institution he worshipped, in front of the very men whose respect he craved above all else. For my entire life, my father lectured me on the weight of a name. In the end, it only took one newscast for him to finally understand the weight of mine. The silence that followed in the officers' club was, by all accounts, absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that no one dared to break. My father didn't rage, he didn't argue, he didn't make excuses. He simply shattered. Without a word to anyone, he stood up from the table on unsteady legs, his face a hollow mask, and stumbled out of the room. He walked away from the wreckage of the world he had built, a man stripped of his own narrative in front of everyone who mattered to him. It was a quiet, pathetic retreat, not a bang, but a whimper. At that exact moment, miles away in my silent apartment, my phone buzzed with a quiet vibration. I looked down and saw a message from a secure number. It was from General Thompson. The text was short, precise, and contained more genuine validation than my father had managed to give me in 30 years. It simply said, "The message was received, Doctor. Well done." That was it. Acknowledgement from my commander. In the end, that single line of recognition from the world I had chosen was the only approval I ever truly needed. The war for my father's acceptance was finally, mercifully, over. 6 months later, I stood at the head of a massive holographic briefing table deep inside the Pentagon. The air here was different. It hummed with purpose and the quiet intensity of people engaged in critical work. I was no longer just a lead analyst working in the shadows. I was now the newly appointed civilian director of the Asymmetrical Strategy Division, a department created specifically around the principles of my Operation Chimera. My ideas, my protocols, my strategies, they were now the foundation of an entire branch of national security. My name was on the door. My team, a mix of seasoned decorated officers and brilliant young analysts fresh from MIT, looked to me for guidance. Their faces held no condescension, no dismissiveness. They held respect. They saw my intellect not as a quaint hobby but as a weapon and a shield for the nation. We debated threat assessments and analyzed satellite data, our minds working in sync. In the quiet, focused energy of that room, I realized the profound truth of my new life. This was my real family. It wasn't a family forged by blood or obligation, but one built on a foundation of mutual respect and proven competence. There was no golden child here, no invisible one. Just a team of professionals, united by a mission, who valued what I brought to the table more than the name I carried. The quiet satisfaction of that belonging was a peace I had never known. It was a house I had built for myself, brick by methodical brick. One afternoon, an email appeared in my inbox that felt like a message from another lifetime. The subject line was just my name, Eris. It was from him. My fingers hovered over the mouse for a moment before I clicked. The words were as stiff and formal as a military press release. "I saw the news report," he wrote. "I was not aware of the nature of your service. It is commendable. Your mother and I would like to speak with you." I read it twice, thrice, looking for something that wasn't there. There was no apology. There was no remorse, no acknowledgement of the years of dismissal. It was a dazed recognition of my new status. He wasn't a father reaching out to a daughter he had hurt. He was a subordinate officer, stunned into acknowledging a superior's rank after a public demonstration of power. The man who had called me bookworm was now using words like service and commendable. The irony was so profound it was almost weightless. And as I looked at his words on the screen, I felt nothing. The old sting was gone. The familiar ache of wanting his approval had vanished. All that remained was a quiet, calm sense of closure. I no longer needed his permission to be proud of who I was. His validation was irrelevant data from a solved equation. With a steady hand, I dragged the email to the archive folder. I didn't delete it. I simply filed it away. It was a record of a past I no longer inhabited. I turned back to the holographic map of the world that dominated my office. Back to the work that mattered, and back to the life I had earned. My father believed a legacy was something you inherit. I learned a true legacy is something you build in silence and have acknowledged in public. If you've ever had to prove your worth to people who refuse to see it, share your story below. In this community, your expertise is always recognized.